Welcome to this latest edition of the Told Stone Q&A, where I answer your questions about the ancient Greeks and Romans. If you have a question about the classical world, ask it in the comments, and I'll add it to my list. To launch right into it, our first question today is, was there any stigma against left-handed people in ancient Rome? This is from Uncleric 3317. The Latin adjective sinister means both left and underhanded, inauspicious. Romance languages have preserved this range of meanings, where left is both left, literally, and things that are seen as somehow disreputable. These, I think, though, reflect the sort of things you do with your left hand, rather than prejudice against those who happen to be dominant left-handed. So in Pompeii, there are advertisements about left-handed gladiators, and we know that Commodus, the emperor who was mad about gladiators, fought lefty all the time. This was something that was interesting, but not necessarily disreputable, kind of like a left-handed pitcher in baseball, where it was an interesting spectacle for those watching it, and a challenge for those who were involved in the fight. We know also about two famous Romans who were left-handed, though in each case because they had lost their right hand. There was the famous hero Mucius Scaevola, who at the dawn of Roman history had thrust his right hand into a burning fire to show the Etruscan king Lars Porsena how little Roman men feared death. He was thereafter left-handed and admired as a hero. We know also about this Rambo-like character named Marcus Sergius Silius, who lost his right hand in campaign, but kept fighting till he lost his left too, and then replaced his right hand with this iron claw thing that he would bash opponents with. So in conclusion, there was no stigma about being left-handed, at least if you lost your right hand doing something awesome. Question 2. Did the Romans have botanical gardens? From the Bassoon Man 2020. In the modern sense, botanical gardens are a recent phenomenon, tied to the Enlightenment fascination with classifying nature, and 19th century ideas about public goods. The Romans, however, certainly had public pleasure gardens, which amounted in some ways to the same thing. Around Rome, there was a sort of suburban green belt, filled with estates owned by the emperors and members of the elite. Some imperial estates were at least intermittently open to the public, and large parts of these were covered by these elaborately landscaped gardens, which had winding paths, fountains, Greek statuary, you name it. Here, bushes were often carefully sculpted into exotic shapes. Pliny the Younger, for example, had an estate where the bushes were carved to the letters of his name. We know also that in Pompeii, on a much humbler scale, the courtyards of houses often had these very rich gardens. We can often find the molds of the tree roots, for example, as hollow cavities in the ash. There was certainly an interest in exotic plants, above all those from the east. We hear about people growing rare varieties, for example, of plants from Greece or the Levant. There was, however, little interest in displaying them systematically, as you might see in a modern botanical garden. Such gardens may, however, have arisen rather organically, literally. We know, for example, the Colosseum was covered in plants from the distant parts of Africa because animals came in from these distant climes with seeds stuck to their fur. And after they died, those seeds bloomed in the crevices of the Colosseum itself. So the Romans created, inadvertently, these exotic landscapes filled with plants from distant places. Our next question is, why did Macedon only rise to power after the Peloponnesian War? This is asked by Karsten Gruten, 3686. Macedon always had a lot of potential. It was a fertile territory with navigable rivers, always a rarity in Greece, lots of timber, which the Athenians coveted for their ships, and some very rich gold mines. But it was prevented from achieving this potential for a long time, both by external forces, above all the Persians, who swept over Macedon a few times, and the colonial ambitions of the Athenians, and by internal factors, most notably the homicidal tendencies of the royal family and the constant disputes between the royals and their ambitious nobles. Harnessing Macedon's inherent potential took the genius of Philip II, who drove the Athenians away from their colonies, introduced the famous Macedonian phalanx, and turned his restless retainers' energies toward conquest. After his reign, and despite very considerable depopulation caused by colonization of the vast new domains to the east, Macedon remained the dominant power of Greece until the Roman conquest for more than 2 centuries. Next question. Why don't the Basques speak a Romance language? Asked by Dictator of Canada, 4238. Basically because they never got around to speaking Latin in the first place. The Romans conquered the Basque country, and what's now more or less northeastern Spain, but it was always peripheral to the rest of the empire. There were no major cities or military bases in the region that would have encouraged widespread adoption of Latin. When the Romans arrived, the Basques were already linguistically isolated, since the peoples around them, and the more accessible plains and lowlands, spoke Celtic tongues. The same isolation that had prevented the Basques from being assimilated by prehistoric Indo-European speakers thousands of years before had separated them from the Gauls and Celtiberians, and eventually also from the Romans. More generally, the use of Latin only became widespread outside of Italy quite gradually. The inhabitants of the new Roman cities of Gaul and Spain and Britain did speak Latin, as did communities that were near the military bases of the frontiers. But among the villages of interior Gaul and Spain, it took centuries for Latin to catch on, and it may not have been till the advent of Christianity, with its Latin liturgy, that the process was completed. Last but not least, did Roman cities have organized crime? Asked by Dodiswatch. Petty crime was rampant in the Roman world. We hear very often about theft, and in Pompeii, for example, we find barred windows and huge iron strongboxes. During major festivals in Rome, we're told, the emperor had to schedule patrols of the streets to discourage theft when the houses were empty and people were away at the theaters. Going out after nightfall, we are told, was always a dangerous proposition. People would be robbed or worse if they came home stumbling drunk after a late symposium or dinner. Taverns were also pretty rough in Rome and elsewhere. We hear about Nero and his friends beating up patrons in Rome's wine shops, and nobody really blinking about this. There are, however, only a few signs of more organized crime. On 2 occasions in Rome, there were mysterious waves of murders, carried out by men who stabbed their victims with poisoned needles in the street. This appears to have been coordinated, but no one knows why or by whom. We hear, even more intriguingly, from Suetonius, that cartels of criminals once terrorized Rome in the reign of Augustus, robbing and murdering at will. He says, to quote, "Gangs of thieves openly went about with swords by their sides. Numerous leagues, too, were formed for the commission of crimes of every kind, assuming the title of some new guild." If this is not literary exaggeration, he's talking apparently about associations of criminals, which sounds awful like organized crime to me, even a primitive sort of mafia. Whatever it was stamped out, supposedly by Augustus, and we hear no more about the mob of ancient Rome. Well, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed these answers. If you have your own questions, ask them in the comments, please, and thanks as always for tuning in.